All right, welcome back to class. This is American Federal Government, and I'm Ken Hicks, and we're entering kind of the final stretch. We're going to do two more presentations over the issue of foreign policy, and I can tell you, foreign policy is a subject that could easily occupy an entire semester. In fact, I am just completing a semester dealing with just the subject of foreign policy. So we're going to talk a little bit about sort of the basic nuts and bolts of how the United States government, or those elements of the United States government, formulate and implement foreign policy for the United States. And again, we want to keep in mind that foreign policy is about, of course, protecting national security, but it also deals with advancing the national interests. We want to make sure that our interactions with the world are favorable for citizens of the United States, and oftentimes that means making decisions that might not seem like they're immediately beneficial to America per se, but that ultimately work in the long-term interests of the United States by preserving stable relationships within the world. And of course, again, the reality is the United States is one of the preeminent economic and military powers in the United States. I jokingly refer to the United States as a super duper power. We have the ability that is unique in the world, and probably unique in the history of the world, in that we can project power to any point in the globe. We have the ability to do things that other countries simply can't do. And as the comic books say, with great power comes great responsibility. So what are we learning today? The first thing we're going to talk about generally are the goals of foreign policy. And again, I mentioned this idea of protecting national security. One of the things that you'll find, there's a military term called mission creep, where at some point, because we are such a powerful nation, we begin to think that everything touches on national security. And then we're going to talk a little bit, secondly, about the governmental institutions and the non-governmental actors that influence and shape how foreign policy is formulated and implemented. So again, we want you to be able to explain how foreign policy is designed to promote security, prosperity, and humanitarian goals. So the first of these things we're going to talk about is this idea of security. Many Americans view national security as, again, as the primordial. This is the sine qua non, the first without which not kind of goal of foreign policy. Governments that cannot control their territory, cannot protect their homeland, are attenuated, oftentimes failed governments. And of course, one of the things that has divided partisans in the United States is this notion that undocumented immigration presents a national threat, and that in fact the people coming across the border, across our southern border, are in fact constitute an invasion. Now, in military terms, invasions are military operations. They are staged. They involve people in uniforms. They involve weapons. They involve the destruction of enemy forces. And in that sense, migrations are not invasions. It is hyperbole to describe what is happening on our southern border as an invasion. Nevertheless, it is one of those things that has tended to galvanize many Americans, in many instances because they are basically ignorant of what is going on the southern border. So while traditional national security interests have focused on the threats posed by other nation states like Nazi Germany in the 1930s, or the Soviet Union in the late 1940s, 50s, and into the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. Today, U.S. foreign policy has to be more broadly concerned with the actions of other groups than nation states. Oftentimes, many non-state actors present serious threats. In the early 2000s, Al-Qaeda was, I think, properly conceived as a serious threat to American national security. So in simple terms, though, security is a very broad term. So in addition to the preservation of the physical security of Americans, The federal government has to be concerned with preserving the security of food supplies, transportation infrastructure, energy supplies. Much of U.S. focus on the Middle East is driven by the fact that 2/3 of the world's proven oil reserves exist in the Middle Eastern, the countries of the Middle East. Now, we don't get a lot of oil out of the Middle East. In fact, we get most of our oil from Canada, Mexico, and Venezuela. And we produce a lot of oil. In fact, I think we are the #1 producer in the world again. But the reality is that many other countries of the world do get their oil from the Middle East, and it is incredibly destabilizing if access to oil from the Middle East were to be attenuated in any way. For that reason, in the late 1970s, Jimmy Carter enunciated what became known as the Carter Doctrine, basically saying that we would use military force to preserve global access to the oil that was coming out of the Middle East. Cyberspace has added another security dimension to U.S. security efforts, and again, we have governmental agencies that work to interdict the efforts of hostile governments, groups, or even individual hackers to damage our computer networks or access to sensitive or proprietary information. Several countries are notable for their efforts to penetrate U.S. Governmental and business, industry, networks. And those include China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran, among others. In fact, recently China has been accused of having penetrated both the Trump and Kamala Harris campaign websites. So again, these are security is a very complex issue that involves a lot of different dimensions these days. So from the founding into the 20th century, most Americans believed that America's geographic remoteness lent to it a certain invulnerability to outside invasion, and that gave rise to the idea of isolationism. Isolationism was built into national security doctrine. George Washington's farewell address warned Americans to avoid permanent alliances with any foreign power. Later on in 1823, President James Monroe articulated the Monroe Doctrine, which warned foreign powers, in particular European powers, not to meddle in the Western Hemisphere. Washington's warning and the Monroe Doctrine formed the cornerstone of national security doctrine until the end of the 19th century. So combined with the doctrine of manifest destiny, the idea that the United States was destined to become a nation from the Atlantic to the Pacific, the U.S. viewed its national security interests as best served by avoiding entangling alliances, preventing foreign interventions in the hemisphere, and securing national expansion from the east to the west coast. Now, it's important to keep in mind that when you think about the challenges related to foreign policy doctrine, that this really lent a kind of parochialism to American foreign policy interests. And so there tended to be this sense in which Americans were very much an inward-looking nation. That didn't mean that we were ignorant or just blithely unaware of the things that were going on outside the world. In fact, we were a vibrant trading power, a vibrant exporting nation, almost from the start. And in fact, many of if you look at the U.S. use of military force outside of declarations of war, we have averaged a use of some kind of military coercion about every 3 years, if you go all the way back to 1786. And in fact, when you hear the Marine Corps anthem, from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli, the shores of Tripoli refer actually to U.S. naval actions on the coast of northern Africa during the Jefferson administration. So it goes all the way back to the early 19th century, that the United States, even though we have been an economically and well, we have not been an economically, we have been a politically isolationist country. We've really never been a culturally or economically isolationist country. And that contrasts with like Asian nations. Japan was an isolationist society in every sense of the word. Its economy was almost entirely contained within the islands of Japan. And it largely refused any sort of outside contact with the rest of the world. Likewise, Korea was, it's often been described as the hermit kingdom because it tried to keep out foreign influences. China likewise had long periods where it was alternatively in a kind of an imperial power, but then it would also kind of fall into long periods of again a kind of isolationist stance where again what is dangerous about cultural isolationism is this sense in which you can come to believe in this sense of cultural or even racial purity. That is the cause for you to say outsiders stay out. America has been vulnerable to those kinds of claims. Of course, we have had the Know Nothing Party was basically kind of a neo-isolationist movement that was really profoundly hostile to Catholics coming into the country. The whole idea in the 1930s of America for Americans really fed a kind of American fascism that had several million adherents in the 1930s. A lot of Americans were profoundly attracted by the ideas of Adolf Hitler. Ultimately, though, the United States we fought in World War I to save the world from democracy. World War I was notable in that it really demonstrated the United States' status as a great power. U.S. entrance into World War I was decisive in terms of pushing the advantage to the Allied sides. But the challenge was that, when the war was over, Woodrow Wilson attempted to propose the democratization of the world and the creation of the League of Nations. He wanted to basically, he and several other world leaders basically wanted to outlaw war as a tool of international statecraft. But the problem was that ultimately the United States Senate rejected the Treaty of Versailles, which both ended World War I but also led to the creation of the League of Nations. So the United States was not a formal member of the League of Nations. And that created a kind of power vacuum. And between 1918 and 1939, what we call the interwar years, you saw a period where there was a genuine power vacuum in the world and where there was a great deal of economic tumult and uncertainty that ultimately culminated in the Great Depression. And you also had the rise of fascism, first in Italy in the 1920s, and then in Germany in the early 1930s. You also saw the rise of a kind of militarized authoritarianism that could be described as fascism in Japan as well. Again, what are the key elements of fascism? It's a kind of hyper-nationalism that says not only are we the exceptional country, and America is very fond of thinking of themselves in exceptional terms, but we also are justified because of our exceptionalism in exploiting other countries for our gain. That's one of the key elements of fascism. There is also this sense of elitism, of a sense in which it's a particular brand of elitism that says that human beings are fundamentally irrational and that they must be led by a singular leader. And it is a kind of dangerous, expansionist, highly militaristic ideology that generally has this focus on a kind of grievance, right? In Germany, it was this belief that that the Germans had been stabbed in the back by Jews who had ended World War I on highly unfavorable terms. And so the rise of these fascist countries, and it's important to keep in mind that Germany and Italy helped in the Spanish Civil War that led to the rise of the fascist regime, the Falangist regime of Francisco Franco. That again, you saw, what was perceived as this fascism on the march in the 1930s that, of course, began, started World War II. Ultimately, the United States stayed out of the war in 1939 when it began. But Franklin Roosevelt understood, even as early as 1938, that there was a likelihood that the United States would find itself drawn into the war. Of course, we ended up fighting the war due to the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Now, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was precipitated by the fact that the United States had imposed an oil embargo on Japan because of their invasion and their attempt to carve out huge enclaves within China. I think the argument for the Japanese was they wanted to conquer a good portion of as much as they could of China. And we were trying to prevent that. And by imposing an oil embargo on Japan, we were really forcing their hand. And Japan militarily came to believe that they could knock the United States quickly out of the war by destroying the American Pacific Fleet. And they thought that bombing Pearl Harbor would decimate America's naval assets in the Pacific. It would take them too long to get naval assets from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and that would give Japan time to basically create such a formidable advantage in terms of territorial conquest of the Pacific Islands that the United States would sue for peace. They fundamentally misunderstood America's resolve. In attacking Pearl Harbor, they provoked a great giant, and in addition, they ultimately failed to destroy the U.S. carriers in the Pacific. And by really 1940, the United States had already inflicted severe defeats on the Imperial Japanese Navy, particularly in the Battle of Midway. And at that point, the United States began fighting a great, two-front war that culminated. We kind of held kind of a holding action in the Pacific while we focused on Europe. We ultimately began in fighting in Italy. We invaded Italy. Of course, we kicked the Germans out of North Africa first, and then we invaded Italy. We ultimately recognized that it was fighting up the length of the peninsula of Italy was not militarily desirable. It was going to cost too many lives in casualties. And so ultimately we launched the great landings at Normandy, and ultimately very quickly defeated Italy. We had already kind of defeated Italy. We then defeated Nazi Germany with the help of the Soviet Union, who was pushing in from the east. And ultimately, World War II ended with kind of the deaths of the Nazi leadership, and ultimately, we then prosecuted successfully the war in Japan. In the process, dropping 2 devastating atomic weapons on the island, basically to show Japan our willingness to eradicate them in order to defeat them, rather than go through an invasion of the Japanese mainland, which was going to be a horrific prospect. Most American military planners during that period thought that it would cost 1 million American lives to invade the Japanese homeland. And so the deployment of the atomic bomb, in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, basically forced the Japanese to sue for peace. Now, in the aftermath of World War II, the one thing that we did not do was recede back into an isolationist posture. We did substantially demobilize, but what we also began doing, and this is something that was planned during World War II by Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt and other world leaders, including Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, was to begin creating international institutions that could be used as forums for communication to prevent future conflicts from breaking out into war. And that led to the replacement of the League of Nations with the United Nations. And the United Nations had a number of important institutions that were designed to, again, on the one hand, raise the costs of one country invading another. The idea of the United Nations was not so idealistic as to think that we could outlaw war, but the hope was that through collective security, we could raise the costs of territorial war to such an extent that people would be dissuaded from pursuing it. Now, that hasn't proven to be the case, but ultimately that was sort of the hope behind it. So one thing that happened in the aftermath of World War II was that very quickly, by around 1947, we began recognizing that U.S.-Soviet relations were not so warm and were likely to continue to become, likely to continue to deteriorate. And so you had a growing U.S.-Soviet rivalry, which began with the attempt by again, what happened in Germany was that the Russians basically held on to those portions of Germany, and that became West Germany, communist-controlled West Germany. And Berlin, which is the largest city in Germany, was about 90 miles within the Soviet-controlled territory. And they attempted to blockade Berlin to prevent any goods from getting in or out of Berlin. And so, ultimately, the United States executed this amazing logistical achievement known as the Berlin Airlift, where we demonstrated basically our ability to continue to supply Berlin for an extended period of time. That caused the Soviet Union to abandon their attempt to seize Berlin as entirely controlled by the communist East German government. But it also began to create this sense of what would become the Cold War, right? The idea that there was an ideological conflict between a capitalist-led world led by the United States and a communist world led by the Soviet Union. So for 50 years or so, America's grand strategy was organized around this idea of containment. And containment really emerged in the thinking of a State Department of high-ranking State Department official by the name of George Kennan. And he articulated in a famous foreign affairs article called The Sources of Soviet Conduct, this idea that the Soviet Union, on the one hand, they are a formidable military power. On the other hand, they are also a weak power. They're fragile because their economy is basically irrational. It was a command economy with central planning. Politics dictated the economy, not the laws of supply and demand. And so Kennan basically argued that the seeds of the Soviet Union's destruction were sown within it, that its internal problems would eventually cause it to collapse. And all that the United States and her allies had to do was apply steady diplomatic pressure and demonstrate resolve to prevent the Soviet Union from taking, snapping up little portions, small countries along the periphery of the worlds between the communists and the free world. Ultimately, that led to the emergence of proxy wars. One thing that happened, Dean Acheson, who was Harry Truman's Secretary of State, gave a speech in which he omitted Korea as one of those countries that the United States considered to be part of its vital national interests. That led North Korea to attempt to invade South Korea. Korea had been a unified country until the end of World War II. It was divided along a geographic line, into a communist North Korea and a capitalist South Korea. North Korea attempted to invade. The United States was ill prepared, but ultimately they did continue to have an occupying force in Japan. They were able to go rapidly to Korea, land a large number of troops in what became known as the Pusan perimeter. We were ultimately able to, George MacArthur, who was basically the occupying governor of Japan at the time, was then able to marshal forces. We began a rapid rearmament during that period, and we were able to execute a naval landing at Incheon, which is a small community on the other side of Korea from the Pusan perimeter, which interdicted North Korean supply lines and ultimately forced them into a reverse. The Korean War lasted several long years. It was a brutal conflict. 35,000 Americans were killed in that conflict, largely owing to the fact that MacArthur drove the North Koreans really well beyond North Korea. They were approaching the Yalu River, and that alarmed the Chinese Communist government that had actually just recently seized control of the country. And they forcefully intervened in the Korean conflict and actually drove America back to what is now the dividing lines between North and South Korea. And the war really has never terminated. We continue to have troops in the in South Korea as a sort of tripwire to prevent North Korea from invading again. Likewise, similarly in the 1950s, you had a similar kind of problem between North and South Vietnam. Now, in Vietnam, it had previously been a French possession. And you had a situation where the French were defeated militarily by the North Vietnamese army, and ultimately we took over again in the 1950s, and we provided military advisors for the South Korean forces for many years. Ultimately, we ended up what Lyndon Johnson did with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution is we basically we Americanized the war. We sent upwards of 600,000 Americans to fight in Vietnam, again over a very extended period. We Americanized the war, I believe, in 1965. And over a 3-year-long period, we bombed North Vietnam, severely, and fought a very fierce counterinsurgency campaign against the North, against the Viet Cong, who were those South Vietnamese who were attempting to expel foreign invaders. In essence, what happened in Vietnam, again, this was a proxy war between the United States attempting to hold on to Vietnam and communist North Vietnam, led by Ho Chi Minh, who got a lot of support from Russia and to some extent from China as well. The bigger problem, though, was that we were also intervening in a kind of civil war between Francophilic Vietnamese, who were Catholic and who were effectively pro-Western and largely perceived by the rest of the country as corrupt, and a largely Buddhist nationalist country that were primarily interested in expelling foreign invaders. Ultimately, again, we lost, a very large number of Americans fighting in that war. We killed over 1 million Vietnamese. But ultimately, by 1975, we were compelled to basically withdraw from Vietnam, which led to a fairly long period of almost 20 years where the United States was very reluctant to use military force in any kind of sustained occupations of other countries. So ultimately, how did the Cold War come to an end? Now again, Kennan made this famous prediction that the United States could outlast the Soviet Union. There were a number of American doctrines that emerged over the course of the Cold War. The Truman Doctrine, which basically elaborated the concept of containment. The Carter Doctrine, which basically, or the Nixon Doctrine, which said we will not send American boys to fight in other nations' conflicts. The Carter Doctrine, which guaranteed that we would use military force to maintain access to the Persian Gulf. And then finally, the Reagan Doctrine, which promised to roll back communist influence in Latin America and Africa. These were all kind of variations on a theme that were dominated by the idea of containing the Soviet Union and preventing the spread of communism. So ultimately, part of what caused the collapse of the Soviet Union, in addition to its, basically its ineffective economy, was its failed occupation of Afghanistan. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979. It fought a 10-year-long insurgency against what were then known as the Mujahideen. And ultimately, like the United States in Vietnam, they failed to conquer that territory. Just as the United States discovered that it's very difficult to govern a steeply jungled country, likewise the Soviet Union discovered that it's very hard to project power into those deeply mountain valleys of Afghanistan. So ultimately, the failure in Afghanistan led to reform efforts. A reformer by the name of Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in the Soviet Union. He attempted through glasnost, which was openness, and perestroika, which was called new thinking, to reform the Soviet Union. He wanted to preserve. He wanted to do what FDR had done for liberal democracy, which was to save it and reform it. Ultimately, he was unable to do so, and the Soviet Union simply collapsed. And all the Warsaw Pact countries, which were those countries that had been conquered by Russia, by the Soviet Union in the aftermath of World War II, and forced into the Soviet Union's political orbit. Countries like Hungary and Poland and Czechoslovakia and Romania. Those countries basically peacefully removed their communist leaderships and began holding elections and began moving towards free market economies. Okay, and so that really created a fundamentally different vision of the world. We were no longer trapped by Cold War thinking, and a number of important factors began to emerge. One being the idea that we no longer had to be armed to the teeth with this enormous nuclear, missile force that threatened, could have destroyed the world 1,000 times over. And so people began thinking in terms of cutting back on defense spending. And so you get, again, what will the United States do? And during the Clinton years, the idea was what he called peaceful engagement and enlargement. The argument was that we needed to expand the community of democratic nations, and we needed to engage with countries that remained authoritarian and move them into the democratic camp. You also had a lot of triumphalism during this period. You had folks like, there was a guy named Francis Fukuyama. He's still around. He still writes really good books. But he wrote a very influential article called The End of History, which basically said that the Cold War's end marks a new epoch in international affairs. That liberal democracy has prevailed, that capitalism has prevailed, and that we will now enter a period where conflicts will be fairly localized and relatively easily managed, and the business of humanity will be in ensuring that everyone has meaningful work and access to health care and little problems like that. One of Fukuyama's mentors, though, a Harvard political scientist by the name of Samuel Huntington, did a not-so-fast moment, and he wrote an article in Foreign Affairs that was called "The Clash of Civilizations." And Huntington prophetically warned that the end of the Cold War is not going to mean the end of international conflicts. That many of these primordial, civilizational conflicts within the Muslim world between Sunnis and Shiites, between civilizations like China and Japan, within Central Europe, that these sorts of civilizational conflicts will now emerge and come to the fore, and we'll have to find ways of managing those conflicts as well. So by the time you get to the 2000s, you've got, effectively a world that is beginning to be affected by events that had, again, occurred earlier. For example, the Iranian Revolution of 1979 unleashes forces within the Middle East that have continued to roil that region to this day. And so there was this presumed peace dividend, but it didn't last very long. I would note that when Bill Clinton left office, we had balanced budgets. The federal government was not spending more than it was taking in tax revenues. In fact, it had a slight tax surplus. The 2000 presidential campaign was a debate between Al Gore Jr., Bill Clinton's vice president, and George W. Bush, the Texas governor, over what to do with the peace dividend. Okay? Ultimately, George W. Bush narrowly won that presidential race, and almost less than a year later, you had the terrorist attacks of 9/11, which again roiled American politics. Was a foundational event that did a great deal to basically inform how the United States pursued foreign policy for the next close to a generation. Basically, the Bush administration's response to the war on terror was to launch, or to the attacks of 9/11 was to launch what would become known as the War on Terror, the global war on terror. It wasn't really a global war, it was a very localized war within the Middle East and in Central Asia, in Western Asia. We first toppled the Taliban regime in Afghanistan that had given harbor to Al-Qaeda, which was the non-state group that launched the 9/11 attacks against the United States. But he then pivoted once we had toppled the Taliban, and he then invaded Iraq. Now, the rationale for the invasion of Iraq was that the regime of Saddam Hussein was anti-Western. It was authoritarian and brutal to its own citizens. But more importantly, the argument of the Bush administrations was that the Hussein regime had access to chemical and biological weapons, to weapons of mass destruction. And the fear was, and this was something that they said quite a bit, multiple Bush administration officials said this, the idea of the smoking gun. We don't want the smoking gun to come in the form of a mushroom cloud. And so ultimately the decision was to invade and occupy Iraq. Now at that point, again, the United States was already occupying Afghanistan, a mountainous regime with a population of over 25 million people. Now we're occupying another country in the Middle East, a Shiite majority country with a population of over 25 million. The rationale for this was articulated by George W. Bush as the Bush Doctrine, and that was the idea that the United States would not wait around on a country to invade us, that we would go after someone if we had reason to believe that they represented a threat. And so fundamentally the challenge then was, how do we manage affairs? And the Bush administration became convinced that the United States could be a force for democratization in the Middle East. And so following his re-election victory in 2004, Bush attempted to create democratic regimes in Afghanistan. He argued for democratization in other Middle Eastern countries. This created what became known as the Arab Spring, where you had a number of, in some instances peaceful, but in most instances violent attempts by people who believed themselves to be oppressed by their own governments, rising up against those governments. It happened in Egypt, it happened in Syria. The Syrian civil war has been going on since 2006, okay? And so, again, recently, Sunni forces in Syria seized Aleppo, which is the second largest city in Syria. They have been on the outskirts of the main capital of Syria. And so there are, of Damascus. And so there are serious conflicts that began, out of these kind of idealistic, well springs. And so ultimately, American foreign policy, again, we ended up fighting a horrible insurgency in Iraq. This was due to an American policy which was known as de-Baathification, where we basically said if anybody had been a member of Saddam Hussein's Ba'ath Party, they had no place in government or the military. Most of those people were Sunnis. Saddam Hussein had been a Sunni Muslim, and that really antagonized the nearly 1/5 of the population. And they rose up in a really fierce insurgency that forced an enormous surge of American troops to put down the insurgency. Again, cost a lot of American lives due to improvised explosive devices, IDFs, and so. Ultimately, again, Americans began experiencing a kind of war weariness by 2008, where we again had been, occupying these countries for upwards of 7 years, and didn't see really an end in sight. There was fears that we were involving ourselves in a quagmire. So that gives rise to Obama coming into the fore. Obama had been an Illinois senator. He ran in 2008, basically articulating something that he would describe as the Obama doctrine. He basically said, "I'm not against all wars, just the dumb ones." He basically said, "I will be prudent in my prosecution of the war on terror." He was not talking about abandoning the war on terror, however. So his approach to foreign policy was less militaristic, but was still there was a serious element of belligerence to it. I mean, he launched the raid that killed Osama bin Laden in Pakistan, which is a nation neighboring to Afghanistan that is an American ally. He used drones far more aggressively than George W. Bush did. And so, again, and he didn't end the occupations of either Afghanistan or Iraq, although, again, he seriously drew down troops in Iraq. Donald Trump, following again after 8 years of Barack Obama, Donald Trump came into power basically arguing for America first, that he was going to pursue a doctrine of, a less militaristic doctrine, but a doctrine that would be economically far more bellicose. And he alternatively adopted a belligerent tone with some of America's allies as well as rivals. He was oddly affectionate towards Russia's President Vladimir Putin. He started enormously, aggressively towards North Korea's leader Kim Jong-un, but ultimately said they fell in love. Oddly enough, he was consistently hostile towards Iran. Okay, so if you look at this slide, it basically shows you the remilitarization of America over the course of the 2000s. Again, if you look at the starting point of that slide, that is 2000. That is Bill Clinton's final military budget. It amounted to about $283 billion. Now, that is still a lot of money, okay? But then you see by 2001, you see a sharp escalation, rising to upwards of $700 billion. Today, we're closing in on $800 billion in defense spending. We are lapping the world in terms of how much we spend on military hardware. Okay? So another important goal of foreign policy is the idea of promoting economic prosperity. Okay, America's international economic policies are intended to expand employment opportunities in the United States, to maintain access to foreign energy supplies, and to promote foreign investment in the United States, and to lower prices that Americans pay for goods and services. If you look at the 2024 elections, you will see that consistently one of the main complaints that Americans had was about inflation, that the cost of goods, that the cost of gasoline was too high, the cost of eggs was too high. So trade policy is a key element of U.S. international economic policy. And Donald Trump basically promised that he would lower prices, okay? The United States is the world's largest importer and exporter of goods. In 2017, it exported more than $2.3 trillion in goods and services while importing $2.9 trillion. Roughly 40 million American jobs in the United States are directly or indirectly tied to international trade, including here in Oklahoma. When you look at all the meat processing plants in western Oklahoma, when you look at those wheat farms in western Oklahoma, in many instances, the products that those farms and those meat processing plants are producing are going abroad, okay? So U.S. trade policy involves a complex arrangements of treaties, tariffs, and other mechanisms of policy formation, including multilateral trade agreements with multiple countries, like with entire regions like the European Union, but also with bilateral trade agreements just between the United States and other countries, okay? So the United States has a complicated relationship with the idea of free trade. Now, what exactly is free trade? This is the idea that we want minimal government involvement in the movement of goods between the United States and other countries. That is the essence of free trade, that you allow people who want to export, you allow Americans who want to export goods to do that with minimal obstacles, okay? The United States has had a complicated relationship with free trade. Most Americans benefit from free trade policies. For example, consumer electronics would be far more expensive if they were not imported from around the world. At the same time, many American industries and their employees are harmed by free trade, in fact, by factories and jobs moving abroad. In fact, the United States had a very large textile industry that that made clothing. I lived in a town, Columbus, Georgia. An entire sector of that town was called Bibb City, and it was a series of textile manufacturing factories and mills. And those things, they went away. Over the course of the late part of the 1920s. Okay, Donald Trump's trade policies. He characterized free trade policies as harmful to American workers. He basically made the argument that previous American presidents had made terrible deals with other countries. Okay, now the reality is that Americans made deals that were attempting to balance the good of Americans versus the good of those other countries. America could, in the post-World War II era, well into the 2000s, they could have driven a hard bargain with other countries. That would have had negative effects on those countries. Okay, we would have harmed For example, I'll use an example of milk, right? The United States has an enormous milk industry. There are states that have huge presence of dairy industries. Wisconsin is prominent, but also the Northeast, Maine and New Hampshire. In fact, California produces, I think, the most milk of all the states. And if the United States were to say to Canada, you have to allow us to sell our milk in Canadian markets, how long do you think it would be before Canadian milk manufacturers were driven out of business? Canada wants to preserve their dairy industry, right? And so they insist on certain kinds of barriers that prevent American milk from flooding Canadian markets and driving Canadian producers out of business. That's the balancing act that is necessary. Trump acted as though that balancing act was a bad deal for Americans. Okay? That was his argument. And so really, beginning in 2018, Trump imposed tariffs on numerous foreign imports that sparked retaliation from American trading partners. While some American manufacturers benefited from tariffs, others were harmed. Ironically, Americans' farm states were, generally supported Trump both in 2016, 2020, and 2024, but they were disproportionately hurt by the trade wars that he provoked. Okay? Again, now today you hear that Donald Trump's favorite word are tariffs. And he's going to raise tariffs. He's talking about a blanket 20 to 25% tariff on all imported goods. What is the consequence going to be of that? I will tell you, most economists will tell you there are strongly inflationary implications to blanket tariffs. TVs are going to cost more. Cars are going to cost more. A lot of dairy products that aren't grown in the United States, a lot of fruit is not going to, it's going to cost more. There are international trade organizations that are, again, designed to promote freedom of trade, that are designed to restrict tariffs and trade wars, okay? The United States is a member of the most important international organization for promoting trade, which is known as the World Trade Organization. The WTA emerged out of what was a post-World War II mechanism known as the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, which again the United States was a leader of and was a major proponent of. Again, what Trump is proposing is basically to ignore the World Trade Organization, to refuse to operate within its limits, and to basically go its own and to enforce unilateral deals. The United States has also joined regional arrangements that are designed to reduce trade barriers. That included the North American Free Trade Agreement, which was negotiated in the early 1990s, and was then replaced by the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, the USMCA, which Trump negotiated in 2018. American foreign policy has also been, seriously driven by the idea of human rights. Jimmy Carter in the 1970s was the first president to say that a critical goal of my administration is the promotion of human rights. While some Americans believe that we should solve our problems at home, many Americans also believe that we have an obligation to protect and advance human rights. This is an important origin point, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute, of the idea of soft power. Soft power refers to the attractiveness of a country's ideals and culture, which enhances a country's ability to persuade allies and dissuade rivals abroad. People are attracted by our culture. Even our enemies find that many of their people like American music. They like American clothing. They like American movies. This is a source of American power. Again, America has a long-standing commitment to human rights, and the United States is a party to most international human rights agreements. Unfortunately, the United States also routinely ignores many of those agreements when they interfere with a presidential administration's foreign policy goal or draw hostile attention to an ally's human rights challenges. I would point to what has happened in Gaza, in the Gaza Strip. When, again, Hamas launched the terrible attacks of October 7th of 2023, the IDF then basically engaged in a pogrom against the population of Gaza. They have destroyed 60% of the buildings. There is pictures and videos of IDF soldiers, killing civilians and destroying buildings that have no military value. That is a human rights violation. And the Biden administration has a role to play and has a complicity in what the Netanyahu administration of Israel has done. It is a terrible, terrible human rights calamity that is happening. There are more Palestinian children now who have been physically maimed than any other place in the world right now. There are more Palestinian children who have lost limbs due to that conflict. So does the United States have an obligation to assist? The United States frequently provides assistance following disasters. Between 2010 and 2017, the United States provided more than $5 billion in assistance to Haiti after a huge earthquake devastated the island nation. In 2020, the United States aided the Republic of Uzbekistan after a dam collapse, displaced more than 70,000 people. We have two huge hospital ships that we send to disaster areas around the globe. Again, the COVID-19 pandemic revealed the limits of international cooperation in the face of global emergencies. For example, I'll ask the question, how did COVID-19 emerge? Did it emerge out of a lab? Did it emerge out of a meat market in Wuhan, China? We don't know because China has not allowed international scientists to go in there and really figure it out. And so we likely won't know until and unless China relents and some future Chinese regime allows people to come in and study the data that they have undoubtedly compiled. Likewise, again, the controversies over U.S. support for Israel's military operations against Hamas in Gaza present a terrible dilemma for American foreign policy. Again, if we're going to allow Israel to basically engage in ethnic cleansing and drive the Palestinians out of the Gaza Strip and then resettle it with Jewish settlers, that is going to be an enormously provocative action in the Middle East. Neighboring countries are going to be enormously provoked by that kind of an action. All right, on to our second major topic. American foreign policy is shaped by government and non-governmental actors, okay? Now, we understand that the framers intended the president to be the chief foreign policy institution. But the Constitution does include checks on executive authority. So to illustrate, the House potentially controls the purse strings and can choose not to fund presidential foreign policy initiatives. The Senate likewise can use its advice and consent authority to reject presidential appointments. There's a very real likelihood that the Senate will reject Donald Trump's nomination of Fox News commentator Pete Hegseth to be Secretary of Defense on a number of grounds. One being, at 40, I think he's in his early 40s, he simply doesn't have the experience. He has served in the military. He was a decorated military officer. He had never risen above the rank of major. Majors don't command more than a company of soldiers. The Secretary of Defense has to, basically control a series of large and powerful organizations that amount to over 1.2 million people and that control over 2.1 uniformed military personnel. So there's very real questions about whether Pete Hegseth has the organizational and administrative competence to serve as Secretary of Defense. Then you have the basic problem that reporting has come out that he has a serious drinking problem. That is a combination, inexperience and a disease, if in effect, that really should. He shouldn't have been nominated in the first place. So, what does the Constitution say that tells us that they intended the framer, that they intended the president to be the chief foreign policy officer? First and foremost, the president is commander of all armed forces, right? We learned that in our discussion of the presidency. Secondly, the president has the power to appoint all executive officers. Thirdly, the president is the chief, he is the commander-in-chief of all military forces. And the Constitution, Article 2, also gives the president the power to recognize other countries. So he is the chief diplomatic officer. These four things really give, in essence, tell you that the framers intended the president to, at the very minimum, be the executor of foreign policy, but also, to some extent, the formulator as well. So it's important to recognize that really only about 5 of the presidents in the post-World War II era had serious serious military or foreign policy experience. Okay, only 5 of the 15. Since World War II, 4 of the successful presidential candidates, FDR, Carter, Reagan, and Clinton, were governors, which doesn't really bring a lot of foreign policy experience. However, FDR had served as Secretary of the Navy during the Wilson administration. 4 presidents are considered to have had significant foreign policy resumes. And that include, of course, Dwight Eisenhower, who had been commander of all military forces during World War II, Richard Nixon, who had served in the Senate and who had served as vice president and had extensive foreign policy experience, George H.W. Bush, Bush Sr., had served as director of the Central Intelligence Agency, had served as chief counsel to China during the Nixon administration, and had been vice president for 8 years. Again, that was significant. And then, of course, Joe Biden, who had been not only vice president, but had also been a senator for over 30 years and had chaired the Foreign Relations Committee numerous times. Okay? All recent presidents have been confronted with significant foreign policy challenges. And again, Bush, who was an inexperienced, foreign policy president, largely, we think, responded imprudently to the challenges presented by the attacks of 9/11. I would also argue Lyndon Johnson, who was inexperienced in foreign policy, really mishandled Vietnam as well. Obama's West Point speech is an important demarcation point. It was delivered on May 28th, 2014. He argued, fundamentally for substituting diplomacy for military force. He was basically making the argument that Americans had become overly reliant on military force. And he argued aggressively, for the use of certain kinds of military force in substitute for occupying foreign countries. Again, you've got Donald Trump and his America First argument. He basically again said, America should be primarily, promoting Americans' self-interests. He adopted, again, a confrontational stance towards both North Korea and Iran. But he ultimately appeared reluctant to use military force. He also frequently resorted to what some of us have described as inverted summitry. Summitry involves nation-to-nation meetings with the leaders. And usually they're culminators of deals, right? And so you would typically have meetings with contemporary rivals at different levels of the government. They would negotiate things. It would go up the chain of command, and gradually you would get to a point where then the leaders could come together to make deals. Trump's inverted summitry basically were press conferences, and they didn't really result in any significant foreign policy achievements. In an important sense, presidents are the deciders. This was something that George W. Bush noted. Presidents decide with whom, when, and how military forces will intervene in the world. Obama, basically assumed responsibility for the raid that resulted in the death of 9/11 in Abbottabad, Pakistan. Presidents frequently, bypass Congress in foreign affairs. So again, you could talk about Obama's use of an executive agreement in the Iran nuclear deal, which was designed to constrain Iran's development of nuclear weapons. Ultimately, in 2017, Donald Trump withdrew from that deal. Maslow's hammer is this idea that, again, Maslow's hammer is a logical thing. It says, to a carpenter whose only tool is a hammer, every problem is a nail. Since 1947, the United States has entered into more than 17,000 different agreements with other nations. As America's military and economic power has expanded, the tendency to resort to military and economic coercion. And again, the United States has unique capacity to twist the screws of other countries' economies. That has tended to become a preferred tool of international coercion. And that, the tendency to conflate national interest with national security has furthered this tendency for the United States leadership to use the tools of statecraft that are more coercive in nature, more impositional in nature. That has eroded America's reputation. That has oftentimes led to complaints that the United States is an arrogant and bullying power. Foreign aid in comparison, again, a lot of Americans tend to overestimate both the amount that the United States spends on foreign aid and the percentage of gross national income that is spent on aid. So when you think about it, the United States in volume gives more than every other country. But in terms of the overall percentage, if you look at it again, the United States only gives about 1.5% of its gross national income in international aid. And again, a lot of that is aid that comes with strings attached. You have to purchase American goods when you're getting humanitarian aid. So among the important institutions that guide the president's actions include the National Security Council. This was created in 1947 as an advisory body within the executive office of the president. It's designed to facilitate, to better coordinate, and to synthesize information and enable presidents to formulate foreign policy. Now, this has given rise to what we call a White House-centered foreign policy approach, where, again, presidents are able to bypass other aspects of the foreign policy establishment as a way of kind of directly moving foreign policy levers around. The heart of the National Security Council is its staff of typically around 200 foreign policy experts drawn from throughout the military and other aspects of the executive branch. Most NSC staffers are foreign policy experts who, again, both military and area experts that can provide the president with detailed analyses of military, economic, and foreign policy issues from any point in the world. The head of the National Security Council is the National Security Advisor, who is appointed by the president and, importantly, is not subject to Senate confirmation. Okay? The State Department is also a very important part of the foreign policy establishment. It was the first agency created in 1789 to handle, again, routine matters of international diplomacy. It is one of the most, again, what's a good way to put it? It's the Secretary of State is typically the most important foreign policy official after the President. The Secretary of State's actual importance, though, will vary depending on his or her relationship to the President. So, for example, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was barely aware that Cordell Hull, his Secretary of State, existed. He ignored him most of the time. He was kind of a political rival. But on the other hand, George W. Bush worked very closely with Condoleezza Rice, who was his second Secretary of State and who had previously served as his national security advisor. So he simply had a closer relationship with her. The State Department oversees a vast network of foreign diplomatic missions. Basically there is a central point which is located in what is known as the Foggy Bottom neighborhood in the District of Columbia. And oftentimes the Harry Truman building is often just described as Foggy Bottom. But beyond that, there are over 30,000, Foreign Service officers who can, basically conduct the diplomacy for the United States. Article 2, it describes the importance of diplomatic recognition. The State Department plays an important and oftentimes behind-the-scene role in the use of diplomacy to promote the general welfare of Americans. As president, Donald Trump did not follow long-established department procedures for diplomacy. Again, he preferred to do face-to-face meetings. Oftentimes, they were not really fruitful, meetings. They didn't really result in anything. Presidential diplomacy, historically presidents have worked to the levers of power to maximize their influence. The Biden administration's challenge following the Hamas 10/7 attacks, represent a challenge in terms of how we manage these kinds of events. In his first term, Trump's lack of discipline oftentimes caused problems. Chief among them was, again, that 2019 phone call to Ukraine's president, basically saying, I'm not going to give you any aid until and unless you announce a criminal investigation into Joe Biden. Another very important agency in the foreign policy establishment is the Department of Defense. It was also created in 1789 as the War Department. There are originally two departments, the War Department and the Department of the Navy. The National Security Act of 1947 reorganized the military establishment into one cabinet-level department. Each of the military services is now led by a chief of staff, which collectively comprise the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which is a major advisory body to the president on military matters. Each of the three main services are also led by a civilian secretary and have military bureaucracies that serve them. Reforming defense, the White House-centered foreign policy has often prioritized the military for information, advice, and policy implementation. Following the Goldwater-Nichols Act of 1986, the military attempted to reform itself and become more integrated. There was an idea of joint action. Reforms in the 1980s created combatant commands, which created basically a shift in the chain of command, where combatant commanders had much greater independence from the Department of State, and they report directly to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Finally, the last group I'm going to talk about is the intelligence community, and that is, again, there are 16 agencies within the intelligence community. Most of them exist within the Department of Defense. The Central Intelligence Agency is supposed to be the chief coordinating body, and it is the chief civilian all-source intelligence agency. All-source intelligence refers to agencies who have the authority to access raw intelligence from every other agency within the community. In addition to the CIA, there are two other such all-source agencies. The Defense Intelligence Agency, which was created following the Bay of Pigs disaster. They focus on military intelligence. And then the Bureau of Intelligence and Research, Research, the BIR, which is located within the State Department. So that's it for our presentation on foreign policy. When we come back, we're going to finish our discussion of foreign policy. That will conclude the course, all the course presentations for this semester. I'll see you next time.